And I want to start with Ambassador Vale Almeida and ask him, before we can discuss the question of what's next for Europe, as our title says, we actually have to understand a little bit more where Europe is. And that has been an interesting question for the course of what we've just heard the past 4 years. The mood in this country certainly was one of concern. Some Europeans felt it was one of some alarmism that the Eurozone would disintegrate tomorrow. Now that mood has shifted a little bit. Might have been something to do with the bond buying program that the ECB announced, and the OMT. But tell us, is this the calm before the storm, before we get right back into the next Spanish, Italian, Greek, or maybe even French crisis, or have we turned the corner?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for hosting me. Thank you very much for coming. It's a real pleasure to be at the World Trade Council. I've been benefiting from your insights, from your hosting, from your hospitality around this country. I see many friends that I've met in different places around the United States. I'm very keen on going outside the Beltway. I've covered 26 or 27 states in 2 years. So it's part of my major priorities, and the World Trade Council, wherever you are, has been extremely helpful. So the least I can do is to come whenever you invite me for your events like this one. Secondly, I think it's very telling and it's a great pleasure to me, a few hours after you have elected your next president, to discuss in a context like this. It's not inward looking, it's outward looking. And I think it is extremely important because the election is always fought on the message. You know that, it's something to be less much to Europe. But in today's globalized world, if I may say so, there are no longer the message. Everything is global. You cannot understand your village if you don't understand the world. And this is a very powerful message that you, World Affairs Council, convey to your public every day in every issue. That's why I'm so pleased to be here. So, about Europe, I must say that this is not a question that I have not been addressing in the last 2.5 years. And I'd like to reassure you, very simply. I can give you a whole speech about, different ones that I should use about Europe. But let me be more personal and more frank. And I'm absolutely convinced that Europe is on the right track for economic recovery. It's on the right track for growth. It's on the right track for overcoming this crisis. I have absolutely no doubt that that will be the case. Why do I say this? Just because I'm paid to say it. But it goes well beyond that. It goes well beyond myself. It has to do with, first, historically going through. The Union was born out of the crisis. We were born because Europeans were tired of war. And because some people realized in the 50s, after the war, that the future for Europe was integration. That our countries could find a common way and not diversity. And with the help of the United States, with the help of people with outward vision in the United States, we built Europe a strong and solid project. Started with 6 countries, now with 27. Half a billion in stability, security, rule of law, democracy, freedom, prosperity. And we were extremely happy and extremely proud to be awarded the Nobel Peace. I think this is, first of all, a recognition of what we have done in the past, a wake-up call for what we need to do in the present, and an encouragement for the future. And I think this gave us a sense of what we need to do that has reinforced my optimism about what Europe is doing now and will do. Basically, we are dealing with the aftershocks of the financial crisis of 2008. These aftershocks had a particular impact in our system, and particularly the most vulnerable countries in our system. But because we have an integrated system, the most prosperous members are very much dependent on what happens to the most vulnerable. Because we have a sense of solidarity, and because the economic integration tells us that we are in this together. There's no way to escape a cumulative effect or a cross-fertilization of the situation inside it. And that's what we did. And in order to overcome this crisis, like many times in the past, like after the war, we are learning the lessons of this crisis. We are taking the necessary steps to move forward. We are in some way addicted to the crisis. But at the same time, we are used to the crisis. And we are used to the ways of overcoming them. So seen from outside, it may look a real serious situation. And I'm not being complacent. It's a difficult one. But I believe it's not that serious as to risk the very foundation of the European Union. So, in a nutshell, what's happening in Europe, we are responding in a consistent way, in a coherent way, I believe. It takes time. It's sometimes messy. It's always noisy. But we get things done. And we will get things done. Now, if you ask me, will Europe be the same in 2, 5, 10 years' time? I don't think so. I think we are going through a major transformation. I cannot guarantee today what the final outcome of this process will be. But my belief firmly is that the solutions that we are finding and will find in the future will result in stronger and deeper economic, political, fiscal, banking integration. And as such, European project that we have been building it for 60 years now will be strengthened and not reduced.
Professor, Steve introduced me as a recovering journalist, and the emphasis here is on journalists, so I will come back to what you said, challenges on a number of
I hope so.
But let's first get Ambassador Kimmitt into the conversation. The U.S. for the past 4 years in its policy towards Europe with regard to the European crises has had a refrain. And that refrain is, be decisive, employ overwhelming force. The Europeans have partly done so to the taste of certainly Timothy Geithner. They haven't done so enough. Now we have a new old administration and an next one. What would you, two pieces of advice that you could give? First, to your own government on how to approach the European problem going forward. And what is it that you would tell the Europeans about this crisis that they may not have learned from America?
Okay, thank you. Let me join the Ambassador and Thomas in saying how pleased I am to be at your annual meeting. Secondly, I really like the fact that it's about national security, it's a new national security that includes economic and finance, as well as traditional diplomatic and military issues, because I think that is the national security challenge that we face today. I would agree with the Ambassador that Europe is in a position now, but still some hard work to do to get through the crisis. It won't be linear. It won't necessarily be timely. It won't be that efficient. Markets have to understand that. This means intersecting the real economy and the political economy. Each side of that equation needs to understand each other better. But I do think that Europe will get through the crisis. Where I disagree maybe a bit with the Ambassador is I think that Europe is dealing with more than the aftermath of the U.S. crisis. I think the U.S. crisis illustrated both in the U.S. and in Europe a fundamental problem, and that was we had gotten ourselves into an era of fiscal indiscipline. We had a serious mismatch between requirements and resources, and we both need to get those back into balance. So on both sides of the Atlantic, we're facing the same question. What is the role, size, and cost of government in an era of globalization, in Europe, declining populations, and stronger competitiveness challenges, particularly from the emerging world? So even as we got through our crisis, and even as you get through yours, a lot of those problems that pre-existed the crisis are still with us today. And again, how do you lay that firmer fiscal foundation and then build on top of it policies that will produce growth, opportunity, and jobs? I think that's a challenge we both have. But it's a challenge, I think, that we can meet together. Both of us, obviously, are looking at China and other emerging markets. But in the lifetime of everyone in this room, and I did notice quite a number of younger people, the dominant economic marketplace is going to remain the transatlantic marketplace in trade and investment. The closer we are to one another, the more effective we're going to be at home and as we reach out to China, India, Brazil, and other emerging markets. So, one thing I would say, let's deepen the dialogue between Europe and the United States. I think we need to have more dialogue in private than in public, even when we disagree. I think it's better to disagree in person with some ideas, not simply complaints. I think particularly we have two mechanisms that offer that opportunity. Maybe this would be my advice on both to the U.S. and to the European governments. Number one, let's make the Transatlantic Economic Council that was set up during the German EU presidency in 2007 an even stronger institution. This was an initiative of Chancellor Merkel, joined by President Bush. The idea was, let's get rid of non-tariff barriers on trade between the U.S. and Europe. The kinds of sort of difficult regulatory and other matters that keep businesses from being able to expand. And there's been a movement to bring accounting standards together, to make some adjustments on air traffic rules and regulations, but there's a lot more that we can do on that non-tariff side. By the way, there are discussions for finance and many other matters there too. And secondly, I think we should pick up more assertively Mrs. Merkel's call for a transatlantic free trade agreement. We're starting in that direction with a high-level group that is working on jobs and competitiveness. But I think it's time to move toward the transatlantic free trade agreement between Europe and the United States so that we go after both the non-tariff and the tariff barriers. But I'll make it very simple. All I ask of people on both sides of the Atlantic, but especially in the United States, is that we give as much attention to tech as we do to APEC, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, and that we give as much attention to a possible transatlantic free trade agreement as we are to the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that's being negotiated in the Pacific space. We are an Atlantic, we are a Pacific country. It does not have to be pursued on a zero-sum basis. We can both deepen the transatlantic relationship and both of us reach out more effectively elsewhere. But we cannot simply wait for crises and problems to come up. I think there is a certain addiction to crises on both sides. Pick up your point, Mr. Ambassador. It's sort of crisis or cliff decision-making. We always make our decisions at the last moment. Most of the European Council meetings end about 2 o'clock in the morning. Why? These are serious issues, tough political issues for the politicians. And in many cases, they need to say, if I hadn't taken that tough political decision, we would have fallen over the cliff or we would have fallen into crisis. I'd like to find a way to normalize it a little bit. And I think we've got an opportunity now with a re-elected president to, I hope, intensify that dialogue. And again, I would use those two pillars as the pathway. And on the European side, challenge the U.S. government again to put as much high-level energy and resource into that dialogue with Europe as they are with Asia.
What do you expect out of that transatlantic economic partnership? If I understand correctly, the high-level group is still working. It might not make it to the December deadline, but negotiations are supposed to start in March. So what is the vision and the expectation level in order to reach so that normalization goal, step back from the brink and have a new big project that connects us?
Thank you. I think I largely agree with this very question. said, to the risk of being taken my job, because I could be speaking almost on behalf of the unions and what he said about our wish to increase and intensify the dialogue. There's no doubt about that. Second point, on what you said, Ambassador, about the crisis. You know, for the sake of argument, I would say that we may need to thank the markets for the pressure they have put on it. Because, in fact, it is because of the market pressure, it is because of this external pressure that we are dealing with the heart of it. We are not only addressing the immediate effect of the financial crisis, we are in fact revamping the whole system, particularly inside the euro, and dealing with issues that are, you know, less directly linked to the crisis, but still very much at the center of the difficulties we have today. Example, the governance of the euro. We realized that we did not have enough mechanisms to address and manage a crisis of this magnitude. Those mechanisms are now in place, and they have been put in place in the last 2 years. Secondly, we realized that we have a monetary policy, a single currency, one single central bank, one inflation policy, but we had 17 inside the euro area fiscal policy, budgetary policy, economic policy, and that to a large extent these policies were not convergent, they were divergent. This is now in the process of being corrected. That's what I call the fiscal union, in which countries will be restrained in their freedom to diverge if they want to remain as part of an economic and monetary union. But also, thirdly, we are dealing with structural problems of our economy. They were not created by the crisis, but they were revealed in all their dimensions by that. And we are dealing with them. Labor markets, the role of the state in the economy, the pension system, the effect and the impact of demographics into public finance. All that has been addressed because there is this pressure from the market, because there is this external factor impacting upon us. We are doing that. Maybe we are doing more than other partners. Maybe you are doing more than Japan. Not to mention the United States, because that's for you to debate and agree upon. But maybe at the end of this cycle, when the global economy goes back to sustainable growth, maybe Europe will be in a better place. Because we would have addressed, because of the pressure, you always require a certain external pressure to move forward. You require elements of crisis to move forward, particularly in a system like mine, like ours in Europe. Maybe we'll be, fitter and stronger when we start a new positive economic cycle. This is to react to what you said earlier. But otherwise, I agree fully on calling on this re-elected president and this new administration, and after the inauguration in January, February, that we give another impetus to the 2020 cycle. And my most important project as we speak today, the one in which I invested more, and my people are investing more, is in fact this negotiation in view of a future comprehensive agreement on trade, investment, and regulatory cooperation. Long words and technical words. Sometimes other people prefer to refer to it as the free trade area. I have no instructions to use that word, but I understand those who use that word. And what counts for me is the ambition and the vision. Basically to say that the two most important economic actors in the world, right? We account, if we include Canada, we are concluding an agreement with Canada in the same direction. We represent 50% of the world's GDP. 50% of the world's GDP. 1/3 of the world's trade. This is big. This is critical. If we are able to agree on an ambitious deal, this will have enormous impact into our economies, because we will remove tariff barriers, non-tariff barriers, and most importantly, will make our economies converge on everything dealing with regulatory. And when you have very low tariff barriers, which is the case today already, you have to invest in non-tariff barriers and regulatory convergence as the drivers for growth, economic growth, job creation. And in doing so, at the bilateral level, we will create an impulse and momentum for the international economy. And we will be sending a very strong message to our partners in China, in India, in Brazil, in Indonesia and Vietnam, in Africa, that, you know, as I used to say, the old guys made business, and the old guys are still capable of making very bold moves. That's the way I see it, and the kind of ambition that we have, and my authorities share this. I hope that in the beginning of this new cycle, we can move forward in a very good cycle.
Listening to you, Ambassador, one gets the impression that Europe is on track, Europe is in the right direction. It may be a messy road, but the goal point is clear. It's a goal point goalpost that is defined by further integration. But one wonders, looking at the European scene, even if the euro crisis has produced the necessity for further integration, especially on the fiscal following the monetary component of the currency zone, do Europeans really want that? Sometimes one has the impression that the elites understand that further integration is necessary, but there really is in countries, certainly not in Great Britain, but also in France and Germany and other countries, smaller or larger, little appetite for further integration. How do you reconcile that, and are you sure you're on the right track to that goalpost when asking your people?
It's a very good question, and you cannot take it for granted. Because in democracy, you should not take anything for granted. Because at the end of the day, you have to ask the people, and you have to confirm the people really support your project. And Europe is democratic by definition, by principle, by practice. And this is the central issue, and I agree with you. As much as we need to progress into towards a banking unit, towards a fiscal union, reaching higher and deeper levels of economic, monetary, financial integration, we need to do exactly the same at the political level. So if we forget the political dimension, if we forget the democratic accountability of this process, if we create a gap between the sort of technocratic solutions and the will of the people, we may find ourselves ultimately having a very nice project, but then we ask people to ratify it in elections, we find out that they are not. So the debate today in Europe, and this is very recent, this has 6 months maximum, is about how do we sort of match this economic, technocratic, technical evolution which was forced upon us largely by this crisis. How do we match that with the necessary democratic accountability, democratic definition of purposes and goals? And that's why we have today in Europe, Chancellor Merkel to begin with, because we voted the ambassador, but many other leaders making suggestions, and sometimes bold suggestions towards political integration. Electing the president of the European Union through a direct vote of all citizens in Europe. Creating and reinforcing the institutions in Brussels. The idea of having a commission that can veto national budgets. And many other ideas. The increased sharing of sovereignty. Countries transferring, greater chunks of their solidarity to the European. That all this is being discussed as, at the same time, we implement these economic, technical, whatever we call it. So this is a very vibrant debate that's taking place. So, don't take it for granted that citizens will follow. Do as much as we can to involve citizens in the democratic debate and be clear about the need to accompany fiscal and backing and monetary union, economic union, deepening the single market with the corresponding political action.
I think that in the course of the crisis, we've learned a few new terms. Terms about divisions of Europe, not about integration in one direction. Northern and Southern Europe didn't used to be a term of reference to describe European affairs. Debtors and creditors. Periphery is certainly to me a new term. To me a new term that the crisis brought about. I think what we are seeing is a two-speed, some people would say, a multi-speed, other people would contend a multi-direction Europe, in which some countries choose to integrate further, others are more skeptical, and the idea of ever closer union certainly isn't shared by all of the European countries as it used to be. What does that mean for the US, for a European strategy of the US? Does it have to have different European strategies, let's say with a semi-detached Great Britain, or let's fantasize one country dropping out of the Eurozone? What types of thinking does the US need to do to respond to this situation?
We had a debate right after the Cold War ended. I was in government and then later ambassador to Germany, whether a Europe coming closer together was in the U.S. interest. This was largely done in the security area at that time, when there was talk about a common European security and defense identity, a Franco-German core, and there were many people who said, wait, that's going to be the beginning of the end of NATO, the beginning of the end of the transatlantic relationship. Ultimately, that was seen as too defensive, too negative an approach. And in the Bush 41 administration, we came up with a paradigm that I would urge today, and that is a Europe that comes together on an outward-looking basis is in Europe's interest, it's in the U.S. interest, it's in the global interest. I think Europe has to make some fundamental decisions about Europe, and the ambassador laid out very well this very vibrant debate that is going on. Thank goodness that the economy that most matters in Europe, Germany, is not debating whether, but how to have more rather than less Europe. I think without Germany on that track, we might see Europe splinter a bit more. Nonetheless, it's still going to be difficult. Debate inside Germany, debate inside Europe. But I think it is in the U.S. interest for Europe to come together, again on an outward-looking basis, not to get so obsessed with what's happening internally that they forget their external obligations, whether it be political, diplomatic, economic, or financial. And again, whatever we call work that we'll do on trade, investment, deregulatory reform, the work that we've been doing at the Transatlantic Economic Council, traditional dialogue we've had through the years, both the U.S.-NATO dialogue, the U.S. dialogue with the European Union, European Commission more broadly. We have to keep those up. It seems to me that if the U.S. shows a willingness to engage with the structure and leadership that Europe has decided upon, we then do our best to help Europe come together again on that outward-looking basis that I think is to our mutual benefit.
Well, but let's assume the trajectory that Britain is on continues in that way. And that is a semi-detached direction, where Britain becomes more of an island. The Prime Minister has now said that he wants to go to the people to ask to approve of what he calls a new settlement, although it's unclear what that new settlement with Europe might look like. It seems pretty clear that any further step of integration that the ambassador alluded to, Britain wants to be no part of. So we're not talking about fiction, we're talking about today. Even today, you're seeing the frame of the construction when looking at Great Britain. What does that, again, trying to challenge you a bit, mean for U.S. strategy? There is a special relationship to Great Britain, but that special relationship, to a degree, has been based on the assumption that Great Britain is an influencer and a major part of the European Union. It doesn't seem to look the way as if the Brits want to play that role in the choose a different path for themselves. What does that mean for American strategy towards Great Britain, but to Europe as a whole?
U.S. does have a special relationship with Britain. We have very good and strong bilateral relations with many other countries in Europe, both Eurozone and European Union. Obviously, Britain is a member of NATO. It's a member of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. We have various forums in which we and the British will continue to interact under any circumstance. I think it has been beneficial for the United States for Britain to be an integral part of Europe. Britain has to decide what its relationship with Europe is going forward. I don't think it's ever helpful for the U.S. to inject itself into domestic political debates in another country. But at the end of the day, I think we would see, again, more Europe that has come together on an outward-looking basis as being in our interests as well as the interests of the countries involved. Britain has had a special relationship with the European Union right from the start. They've made certain decisions, certain reservations, and the ones that started in November and December of last year were not the first ones. This has always been a complicated part of British politics. It will remain. I think they need to figure that out. I think the signals being sent by Europe, I hope by the United States, though, is we have benefited in peace and security terms and economic and financial terms by deepening those relations between the U.S. and Europe on a transatlantic basis. I would like to see it continue, but again, the choice is theirs.
David Cameron and Angela Merkel are meeting again this week. She wants more Europe, he wants less Europe. Please reconcile less Europe with the vision that you outlined a few minutes ago.
Well, I think it's up to the British people to decide what they want to do. One thing I think is clear, no one in Europe wants Britain to leave. I don't see any movement in Europe to say they should go out. I think most people realize that Britain is a major component of our project. And it adds not only in a positive way, but in a qualitative way, because they have a way of receiving things, they have a relationship with the outside world, they brought a lot to the Europeans. But again, it's the choice of the British people and the British political system to organize that, the definition of that choice. And I certainly don't want to interfere. What is clear is for us in Europe, all member states are equal. All member states contribute to the discussion. And we want to have a very deep and open and frank debate about the future of Europe. But again, I cannot speak on behalf of Britain. I think our position, at least mine personally, is that we would like to see the Union as it is today and its people. And we are hopefully having Croatia as a 20th member very soon. We have a few other countries that are prepared to join the Union in the next years to come. So what I'd like to see is not only Europe as it is today, but expanding. And I certainly don't wish anybody to leave, but we cannot prevent that from happening. So it's a debate that has to take place, first and foremost inside the United Kingdom, and certainly with the other parties, because people are not ignoring the debate. And I think when British and German politicians meet, I think that's a issue. Because, as I said earlier, whatever happens inside the European Union is relevant for all the members of the European Union, because our level of integration is so important.
Before turning to the audience, because I imagine you might have multiple questions for these two gentlemen, one more question about more Europe. On a headline basis, the sort of officialdom of Europe, of the European Union, has rallied around the more Europe. But when you look at those that it is most associated with, which is Angela Merkel and the Germans, you sometimes have the impression that they want to go as slow as possible and do as little as possible. What do I mean by that? Let's take the banking union as part of the fiscal union that you alluded to in your remarks. It seems the Germans didn't want the banking union in the first place. If they wanted, they want only part of it, the oversight part of it now. They could do without deposit insurance for quite some time, if ever. And if they want the oversight, they don't want it immediately, they want it later. And if they want it later, they don't want it all-encompassing with all banks, but want fewer banks. So what is your read of more Europe that means more Europe in incremental steps and as little as possible?
Well, I have no doubt that Master Kimmitt knows Germany certainly better than I do, and there. But there is no doubt in my mind about the European commitment to Germany. Certainly not Chancellor Merkel, but the whole German political system and Germany as a country. And this has, of course, historical reasons that we all know, but it has very solid economically. I mean, the success of the German economy today, you cannot explain it without Europe. You cannot explain the exporting capacity of Germany today without Europe. European single market, 500 million people, 500 million people have prosperous consumers. Open markets, open borders. This is the bad thing of Germany's exporting, formidable exporting capacity. You know, they could not export what they export to China with such success if they had not built that capacity inside the European continent. Think about the currency. Germany benefits from the euro. Imagine the value of the Deutsche Mark if it still existed today. It will not be at $1.3. It will be well diminished. Where would be the exporting capacity, competitiveness of German exports in that alternative scenario? And I'm giving you just two elements of, very down-to-earth economic facts and arguments. I'm not mentioning things much more important than that has to do with the recent history of Germany and the fact that Germany reunited very much under the auspices of Europe. There were financial transfers from the other member states of the European Union to help Germany reunification. This is a fact. So all of this should not be forgotten. When some people, maybe too quickly, question European commitment, I have no for objective and subjective reasons, present and past reasons, and certain future reasons, which have to do with another aspect that we sometimes do when we talk about it, is that all the countries in my system realize that they are all of them too small to really influence the course of events in today's world, if they are certainly a country like mine, Portugal, or the small and medium-sized countries, because it's unstable. But even the big countries, and this is also relevant to the previous discussion, or even the bigger countries realize that in today's world they need scale, they need critical. The Chinese look at us in a different way as soon as they realized back in 2004, gosh, these guys are becoming after billion. The Chinese only consider things when they move beyond a certain scale. And half a billion is something that they recognize in the world. And the dimension of scale, don't overlook it, don't underestimate it, because this is one, not usually, but one of the reasons behind the rationale that leads all my countries to want to stay and reinforce in this.
Steve Sokol has reminded me we have to close at 3:30 sharp, which gives us about 8-9 minutes to bring in a couple of your questions. There's a microphone I see right here. Who wants to be first to the microphone?
When the euro was created, there were the same concerns about many fiscal policies and a single monetary policy and strict limits were set at that time. Unfortunately, the two countries that went over them the quickest were France and Germany, and therefore the penalties never happened. What makes you think that will change in the future?
We'll take another one and then give.
Yes, this is Wayne Lord, World Affairs Council of Atlanta. I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you for this panel. It's a great kickoff to the next 18 months for our own council, because we are starting an 18-month series in January on Europe and looking at the issues of integration, but also on the potential for that massive free trade agreement that you're discussing. We do have the British ambassador coming a week from Monday to Atlanta, and presumably under the title Cliffs, Crises, and the Global Growth Challenge, that he will share some interesting information that follows up this panel. Thank you. The question is, with that potential enormous trade agreement that could happen, if it happens, what are the barriers to that? We can see many benefits. We have great investment in the southeastern part of the United States, from Europe, from all the individual countries, certainly. What are the barriers to achieving that goal of the trade agreement as you see it today?
I'll take the first one. I think it's a very good question. I would say, as we look back at Maastricht 20 years ago, it was successful on the monetary side. I think the common currency, the common central bank, as the ambassador outlined, inflation in Europe is lower since the ECB began its work than in the previous years under the Bundesbank in Germany. I think it's been a very strong performance on the monetary side, but it was a weak performance on the fiscal side for the reasons that you suggested. The biggest countries were the first ones to break the criteria, most important, that is keeping the deficits to within 3% of GDP. I think the ambassador made a very important point early in the conversation, and that is not only did they get away with it politically in the 90s and early 2000s, but the markets did penalize Germany and France for not sticking to the fiscal criteria that had been established. I don't think the markets will be as lenient this time just because of what the markets have been through, both in our crisis and in the European crisis. So not only is it in Europe's political interest, I think it's in Europe's financial, economic, and market interest to hold to the agreements this time.
Well, on the first question, I agree, of course, with what was just said. It was an issue of enforcement, it was an issue of political will. Political will, you cannot impose it on anyone. It has to come from within. What I see today in Europe is that we are learning the lessons of the crisis, and exactly those countries, those two countries that, as you referred, violated before anybody else the rules that they have themselves established, now realize that it was a mistake, and now realize that it's contrary to their interests to do that. And the commitments they have for fiscal rigor are there to prove it. But we need to act on the enforcement side. We need to sort of contain the political will, capacity to move away from commitments by strict and rigid enforcement frameworks. And this is what we are applying today. So if they were to violate the rules as they did a few years ago, the impact of the sanctions will be much more important and relevant than they were at the time. And most of all, like Ambassador said, the markets will be there attentively. Markets are not perfect, because they accepted situations a few years ago that they now consider being unacceptable. But they did accept. They didn't make any wake-up calls or alert or alarm bells were not triggered a few years ago, which are ringing now. So, nobody's perfect, not even the markets. But in this particular case, I think they will be very critical of any violation that will happen in the future. On the second question, coming from Atlanta, I guess, I have not yet been to Atlanta, so I would be great if in the near future.
Please accept our invitation.
Thank you. It was a provoked invitation, but still, I take it as a genuine and frank one. I hope to be able to go there. Let's hope so. On the trade agreement, I'm a great believer in it, to be frank on a personal basis, so I'm a little bit biased. I think this is a great project which has all the meaning you want to attach to it, and I highlighted that you have done quite well. The barriers to a trade agreement, you always have vested interests. You always have the inertia of the system, and the change is something that it's difficult to implement. I'm not echoing that in political debate, but change is difficult in the trade policy, and particularly it is difficult to implement when we talk about regulations, regulatory. So there's a lot that we need to do, but the potential in bilateral terms is huge, and the potential, as I said earlier, globally is also very important. So what I would like to see as the new cycle starts here in the US is a political commitment from the highest level inside the administration and inside the Congress. And we are very much aware that a lot depends on the Congress position, to move away from sometimes narrow-minded protection of some interests to a bigger picture, to a larger vision of what is at stake here for the transatlantic relationship, but also for our common sense in the world as we deal with emerging economies.
Now, I see the lady in the back is patiently waiting. At the same time, I've been told we need to stop right here. I don't know what to say now. May I suggest for you to come to the side and we'll try to answer your question individually, because I think your program needs to move on. And let me thank both panelists. We are for this crisis, if you would think. Everything has been said, but today again, I have to say personally that I've learned quite a bit through this conversation, and I hope that sentiment is shared by the audience. So thank you all.